It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina. The golden sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns of the Davis family estate. Emma Davis, a woman in her late 20s, sat on the porch of her family's grand house. She had always felt out of place in the polished world her mother, Karen, had crafted around them. The wealth, the social circles, the parties. They never really felt like they were meant for her. She was just the daughter, an accessory in a life of luxury. Her mind was elsewhere as she stirred her coffee absently. She'd just finished a long weekend getaway to New York with her boyfriend, and while the trip was supposed to have been a distraction, something kept nagging at her. It was the email she'd received the day before while she was away. It was from her mother's lawyer. The subject line had been simple enough. Regarding the change in your mother's will and beneficiary designation. Emma had barely given it a second thought at first, dismissing it as another routine update. But then, while on the train back from the airport, Emma had opened the email. The words inside made her stomach drop. Her mother had changed the beneficiary on her $5 million life insurance policy. It was a blow to Emma, one that was impossible to ignore. She wasn't particularly close to Karen anymore. But this was the one thing that had always given Emma some comfort. The money was supposed to be hers, or so she thought. In the back of her mind, Emma had always believed she would inherit everything her mother had worked so hard to build. Karen, a self-made woman who had risen from humble beginnings to create a fortune, had always been Emma's rock. But something had changed in the past year. The last time they had spoken, things had been strained. Emma had noticed her mother pulling away, becoming more distant and secretive. She chalked it up to the stress of her business. But now Emma began to wonder if there was something more to it. After staring at the email for what felt like an eternity, Emma made the decision to confront her mother. Later that afternoon, Emma stood in front of the large, imposing house where she had spent most of her life. She had come to demand an explanation. The anger was bubbling up inside her, and she couldn't suppress it. Her mother was in her late 50s now, a woman whose elegance and poise had made her the envy of many. But Emma had seen the cracks in that facade for years. Her mother's obsession with control, with perfection, had driven a wedge between them. Emma had always felt like a disappointment in her eyes, and now, this. As she entered the house, she was met with the faint smell of lilies, Karen's favorite flower. The house felt colder than it ever had, and Emma's footsteps echoed through the large hallway. She could hear Karen's voice coming from the living room, speaking to someone on the phone. "Mom!" Emma called out, her voice sharp, carrying the weight of her frustration. Karen's gaze flickered up from the phone as Emma entered. She wasn't surprised by her daughter's presence. In fact, she seemed oddly prepared for it. "I'll call you back," Karen said into the phone before hanging up. She then stood up from the leather armchair, her face showing no signs of guilt, no trace of concern. "Is everything okay, Emma?" Karen asked, her voice smooth. But Emma could detect the coolness beneath the question. "No, everything is not okay," Emma snapped. "I saw the email." Karen's eyes darkened slightly, though she masked it quickly. "I see. You got the notification about the policy change." "Why did you change it?" Emma demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. "That money was supposed to be mine, Mom. I've been your daughter my whole life. Why would you do this to me?" Karen's expression hardened. "I did what I thought was best. You wouldn't understand." "Best for who?" Emma shot back, her face flushed with anger. "You've always controlled everything, and now this. Why change the beneficiary? Who's getting the money now?" "None of your business," Karen replied coldly, her eyes narrowing. "You need to learn some respect." The words stung, but Emma didn't back down. Her hands trembled with a mix of rage and hurt. "I've been your daughter my whole life, and this is how you repay me?" For a moment, there was silence between them. Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest. The woman in front of her was not the same mother she had known growing up. She seemed like a stranger now. Karen's voice was soft, almost soothing, when she spoke next. "I've made my decision, Emma. There's nothing more to discuss." The words felt like a final verdict, sealing something between them that could never be undone. Emma's anger, once simmering, now bubbled over into something darker, something she couldn't control. She clenched her fists, feeling the heat of betrayal coursing through her veins. Karen's calmness, her indifference pushed Emma beyond reason. In that moment, something in her snapped. She had always felt like a pawn in her mother's game, always being pushed aside for others, always second place. Without thinking, Emma moved quickly. She grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy glass vase, and before her mother could react, Emma struck her mother across the head. Karen crumpled to the floor in an instant, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. But no sound came out. The blood began to pool around her, staining the expensive carpet beneath her. Emma stood there, breathless, her hands shaking, staring at the woman who had once been her world. The house was eerily silent, save for the sound of Emma's heavy breathing. It was over. There was no going back now. The weight of what she had just done settled heavily on Emma's shoulders, but it was the feeling of finality, of control that overwhelmed her. She had been rejected by her mother, but now, in some twisted way, she had the power. She was the one who would make the decisions from here on out. With trembling hands, Emma called 911, but the words didn't come easily. She had no idea what she would say. Would she confess? Would she try to explain herself? The thought of talking to the police made her feel sick, but she knew she had no choice. The call went through, and Emma's voice, barely a whisper, told the operator that her mother had been injured. And so, the investigation began. The 911 call was brief, but it was enough. Emma didn't know it at the time, but her words were already setting the stage for a complex and tragic investigation that would uncover far more than anyone could have predicted. Within minutes, the wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as the police cars approached the Davis estate. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the blood on the floor now a stark reminder of what she had just done. Her hands, which still shook, were stained with the crimson marks of her mother's life. The vase she had used to strike her mother lay nearby, its delicate shards scattered across the room like the shattered pieces of her own life. The officers arrived with their standard routine, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced calm. Detective Tom Henderson, a seasoned investigator in his mid-40s with a reputation for getting to the truth no matter what, led the team into the house. His tall frame moved with a purposeful confidence as he surveyed the scene. There was nothing extraordinary about the house itself. Its polished surfaces, expensive furniture, and large windows reflected wealth and success. But now all those outward symbols of privilege felt hollow. His first step was to approach Emma, who was standing motionless, a look of shock still plastered across her face. She hadn't moved since the 911 operator had asked her what happened. She didn't know what to say. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Detective Henderson asked, his voice firm yet calm. He was used to dealing with shock, but he didn't take any chances when it came to victims or suspects. Emma nodded, though she couldn't look him in the eye. Her thoughts were jumbled. Her mind was racing, questions about what she had done, how to explain it, if she could even explain it. The thought of her mother's blood pooling around her was enough to make her stomach churn. I I found her like this," Emma stammered. I don't know what happened. She fell." Detective Henderson studied her closely, his sharp gaze noting the tremor in her voice, the sweat on her forehead. There was a distinct contrast between Emma's unkempt appearance and the polished surroundings of the house. She looked out of place, and it was clear that something was wrong. He wasn't buying the "she fell" explanation, but he also knew not to push too hard, too fast. At this point, Emma was the one who could either confirm or unravel the events that had led to the tragedy. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" he asked. Emma nodded again, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she reluctantly sank into the nearest chair. She felt a surge of guilt over what had just happened, but she couldn't stop the whirlwind of emotions that filled her chest. "Where were you when it happened, Miss Davis?" Henderson asked, taking a seat across from her, his voice as steady as the rest of him. I I came in from outside," Emma muttered, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I had just gotten back from a trip to New York. I came in and she was already like this." "And what did you find when you entered the room?" Henderson pressed, his gaze never leaving Emma's face. He knew she was holding something back, but he wasn't about to jump to conclusions just yet. She was sitting there in her chair, Emma said, her voice now quieter. She was on the phone, and then she stopped talking. She just stared at me like she was disappointed. And I don't know why, but I just couldn't take it anymore. Henderson raised an eyebrow. You couldn't take what anymore? The conversation? Emma's voice trembled. She wasn't sure she was ready to admit to herself what she had done, let alone say it out loud. I, I don't know, she whispered, her face pale. I didn't mean to. I didn't want her dead. But I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't deal with her anymore. She, she changed the beneficiary on the policy, detective. It was supposed to be mine. Henderson's eyes narrowed. The mention of the life insurance policy caught his attention immediately. There was always something about financial matters that seemed to intertwine with motives for violence. This could be more than a simple act of anger. He needed more information. Could you explain that? What do you mean it was supposed to be yours? Emma shifted uncomfortably in the chair, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was losing control, and she knew it. My mother had always promised me the life insurance policy, Emma said, her voice shaking. She told me that after she passed, I'd be taken care of, that the money would be mine. It was the only thing I had left of her. But when I got back and saw that she changed it, I just snapped. Henderson processed this carefully. The fact that Emma knew so much about her mother's financial details was suspicious. It didn't sound like the words of someone who had simply stumbled into a violent moment of rage. He was starting to form a theory, but he needed to hear more. And what did she say when you confronted her about it? Henderson asked, leaning forward slightly. She said it was her decision, Emma muttered bitterly. She said it wasn't my business. She said I wouldn't understand. She didn't care about me anymore. The detective's mind was working quickly. There was a lot that didn't add up. For one, Emma seemed almost too calm about the situation, and her story didn't fully match up with the physical evidence. Emma had been the one to find her mother, but the violence didn't seem to align with what she was describing. Do you have any idea who the new beneficiary is? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know, Emma said, shaking her head. But I know it's not me. It's someone else. Henderson's suspicion grew. It was time to bring in the forensic team. Within the hour, the forensic team had arrived, setting up the crime scene with meticulous care. They dusted for fingerprints, took photos, and gathered evidence from around the room. Detective Henderson stood off to the side, watching as the team worked. He needed answers, and he was going to get them. As the investigation progressed, Emma's story began to unravel. The medical examiner's preliminary report suggested that Karen Davis had died from blunt force trauma. The vase, which Emma had confessed to using, was a likely weapon. There were signs of struggle around the area where Karen had been struck, suggesting that Karen had tried to defend herself. But there was something more, something that didn't quite fit. A deeper look into the changes to the life insurance policy revealed that Emma wasn't the only one affected. The new beneficiary was not a person at all, but a charity, a cancer research foundation that Karen had supported for years. The news sent shockwaves through the investigation. Why would Karen make such a dramatic shift in her beneficiary? And why had Emma been so unaware of it? The deeper they dug, the more questions arose. Henderson was certain of one thing. This was far from a simple case of rage. And Emma's role in her mother's death was only the beginning. The true story had yet to unfold. The days following Karen Davis's death were filled with tension. The media swarmed the story as it had all the hallmarks of a high-profile tragedy: wealth, betrayal, a daughter at the center of it all. But Detective Thomas Henderson wasn't interested in the headlines. He was interested in the truth, and right now, everything about the case was tangled in contradictions. After taking Emma's statement, Henderson had the opportunity to dig deeper. The facts, however, were far from clear-cut. The first step in his investigation was to learn more about Karen Davis's financial matters. From what Emma had told him, Karen's $5 million life insurance policy had always been a source of comfort to her daughter, but now that comfort had been ripped away, leaving only a gaping hole of confusion and resentment. Why would Karen change the beneficiary? especially to a charity that Emma knew so little about. Henderson sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the files that had been compiled so far. He had access to Karen's financial records, and what he found only deepened his suspicion. The change in beneficiary had not been an impulsive decision. It had been made 6 months ago, far too long for Emma to have been blindsided by it. The records showed that Karen had made significant donations to the Cancer Research Foundation over the years. She had attended their galas, made appearances on their behalf, and even publicly spoke about the importance of their cause. But it wasn't just a charitable decision. Henderson noted that in the months leading up to her death, Karen had increased her financial support dramatically, funneling millions into the foundation. It was clear that Karen had been passionate about the cause, but there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. The insurance change wasn't merely a donation, it was an act of legacy. The thought crossed Henderson's mind. Did Karen know something about her health that no one else did? Was she planning for something more? The next morning, Henderson met with the head of the Cancer Research Foundation, a woman named Dr. Lucy Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell was a tall, composed woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for being both brilliant and tough. She had known Karen Davis for years, and Henderson hoped she could shed some light on the motivations behind the life insurance change. "Detective Henderson, I'm sorry for your loss," Dr. Blackwell said when she entered the small conference room. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were wary. She had been briefed on the situation and knew the gravity of the questions being asked. "Thank you," Henderson replied, keeping his tone professional. "I'm hoping you can help me understand Karen's connection to the foundation a bit more. She made a significant contribution recently, and I'd like to know what led to it." Dr. Blackwell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Karen was a generous donor, but I've known her to be very private about her reasons. She didn't want anyone to know the extent of her support, particularly her family. She believed deeply in the cause, but she also had a more personal connection." "A personal connection?" Henderson asked, leaning forward. "What do you mean by that?" Dr. Blackwell looked away briefly before speaking. "Karen was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer about a year ago. She didn't tell anyone, not even her daughter. I think she wanted to keep her strength intact, to keep up appearances." Henderson's mind raced. This was the first he had heard of Karen's illness, and it changed everything. If Karen had known her time was limited, that would explain the drastic changes in her will and insurance policy. But why hadn't Emma known? Why was Emma kept in the dark? "And Emma," Henderson asked, "what did she know about her mother's diagnosis?" "I don't believe Emma knew at all," Dr. Blackwell replied. "Karen made a point of keeping it from everyone. She didn't want to be pitied. She was proud. She wanted to leave behind a legacy that mattered." Henderson took a moment to absorb this information. The puzzle was starting to come together. Karen's actions now made more sense, but it also painted a much darker picture. Emma's reaction to the life insurance change, her anger, her rage, it all suddenly felt more like a reaction to betrayal than a simple financial disagreement. If Emma had been unaware of her mother's illness, that would explain the shock and the deep hurt. But that still didn't explain the violence. The next step was to speak with Emma again. Henderson wanted to confront her with what he had just learned, to see how she would react to the revelation about her mother's cancer. Emma had already told him that she hadn't been close to her mother in recent months. But had she known about the illness? Was this information deliberately kept from her, or was there something else at play? He met her at the police station, where she had been asked to come in for further questioning. Emma's appearance had changed since their last encounter. She looked more disheveled now, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She was nervous, and it was clear that the weight of her mother's death was beginning to take its toll on her. "Emma," Henderson began gently, "I've come across some information that I need to talk to you about. It's regarding your mother's health." Emma's face immediately darkened, her expression guarded. "What about her health?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "She had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer," Henderson said, watching her closely. "She kept it a secret. No one knew, not even you." Emma blinked, her face a mask of disbelief. "That's impossible," she whispered. "She would have told me. She, she wouldn't have kept something like that from me. We were close, detective. She wouldn't have kept something so important from me. Henderson studied her carefully. Are you sure about that? She was working closely with the Cancer Research Foundation. She had been very involved in their work, but only in recent months did her donations grow significantly. That's when we found out about the cancer. She had been keeping it hidden. Emma's face flushed with anger. You're wrong, she said, her voice rising. She never told me? Why wouldn't she? Why keep that from me? Henderson paused, giving her time to process the information. He needed her to come to terms with it, to confront the reality of her mother's secret life. I'm not saying she didn't love you, Emma, but she made choices about her legacy. It wasn't just about the insurance policy. It was about what she wanted to leave behind. Emma's jaw clenched. You think I'm just angry about the money, don't you? This is about more than money, detective. She lied to me. She lied to everyone. Henderson's voice softened. I think there's more to this than what we're seeing. But I need you to be honest with me, Emma. Did you know anything about her illness? Did you know she was sick? Emma shook her head violently. No, I didn't. She kept everything from me. But maybe it wasn't just her illness that drove me to do what I did. Maybe it was the years of lies, the years of pretending everything was fine. I didn't just lose my mother that day, detective. I lost everything. Her words hung in the air. Henderson had his answer. Emma's anger wasn't just about betrayal. It was about feeling abandoned, rejected, unseen. And in the heat of her emotions, she had struck out. But there were still too many questions left unanswered. What had truly transpired in the moments before Karen's death? Had Emma killed in a blind rage? Or was there something deeper at play? The investigation was far from over. Detective Henderson spent long hours reviewing the evidence, speaking to witnesses, and piecing together the chaotic fragments of the Davis family tragedy. Emma Davis's growing distress was palpable, but the more he investigated, the more he sensed that there were layers to this case that had yet to be uncovered. The autopsy report confirmed much of what he already suspected. Karen Davis had indeed been struck with blunt force trauma to the head, the fatal blow from the glass vase. But there was something more, something that didn't quite sit right. The medical examiner noted signs of defensive wounds, particularly on Karen's forearms, suggesting that she had tried to protect herself before the fatal blow. Yet Emma's earlier statement had painted a picture of an unprovoked attack, a moment of blind rage. A week after the tragic death, Henderson was sitting in his office, staring at the case file, when his phone rang. It was the lab results. He answered the call with a quick, "Henderson." "Detective, we found something unusual," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We've analyzed the blood spatter patterns at the crime scene, and there's something you need to see." Henderson's pulse quickened. Blood spatter analysis could tell him so much about the circumstances of the crime, the position of the victim, the nature of the attack, even the distance between the killer and the victim. It was one of the most telling pieces of forensic evidence. "I'm on my way," he said quickly, grabbing his coat and rushing out of the office. When he arrived at the forensics lab, he was met by the lead technician, a meticulous investigator named Sarah Mills. She led him to the analysis room, where the blood spatter evidence was laid out on a large table, a series of photographs and diagrams showing the trajectory of the blood droplets. "Take a look at this," Mills said, pointing to a series of photos. "Based on the blood patterns, we can conclude that the first strike, likely the one that caused the major head trauma, was delivered from a distance of around 3 feet. However, there are secondary splatters that indicate the victim may have been standing at some point during the struggle. What doesn't fit, though, is Emma's statement that her mother was sitting in the chair when the attack occurred." Henderson examined the photos carefully. It was clear now that Karen had not been sitting still during the attack. The blood spatter suggested she had been moving, attempting to defend herself, something Emma had not mentioned. And if Karen had been standing or moving, that meant the confrontation was not as one-sided as Emma had described. "The position of the victim's body also tells us something," Mills continued, showing him the final photo. "After Karen was struck, she likely collapsed immediately, but the way her body fell, it indicates that she wasn't just surprised by the attack. She likely struggled to regain her balance. The blood splatter around the scene suggests there was a fight. So she fought back, Henderson mused, thinking aloud. But Emma said she came into the room and found her mother already dead. Mills nodded. Exactly. Something doesn't add up. If there was a fight, then there must have been more to the confrontation. Maybe Emma's story is incomplete. The new information gave Henderson a different angle to pursue. He returned to the Davis estate the following morning, feeling a sense of urgency. It was clear now that Emma's story wasn't as simple as a sudden act of rage. There was a deeper complexity to her emotions and actions. The next step was to speak with her again, this time with a sharper focus. When Emma arrived at the station for questioning, she appeared even more haggard than before. The grief had consumed her over the past few days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she had trouble maintaining eye contact. But Henderson had been through enough interrogations to know when someone was hiding something. Emma was no different. Emma, Henderson began, taking a seat across from her. I've been reviewing the evidence again, and there's something that doesn't quite fit with your story. You mentioned finding your mother sitting in her chair when you entered the room. But according to the blood spatter analysis, your mother was likely standing when the attack occurred. She had defensive wounds on her forearms, and it looks like she tried to fight back. Emma's face grew pale as Henderson spoke. He watched for any signs of guilt, but her expression remained stoic. I told you what happened, Detective, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I came in, and she was sitting there. I didn't hurt her until she told me I wasn't important to her anymore. I understand you were upset, Emma, Henderson said gently. But the physical evidence doesn't match your statement. The blood patterns suggest that your mother was trying to defend herself. She was moving, not just sitting, and she didn't just collapse after the first blow. She fought back. For a moment, Emma didn't respond. She shifted in her chair, and Henderson could see her hands tremble slightly, despite her attempt to control them. There was a long silence before Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to hurt her, Detective. I didn't plan it. But she pushed me. I didn't know how far I'd go. She never took me seriously. All I wanted was her approval. The money, the policy. It was supposed to be mine. She always said she loved me, but she never showed it. Henderson's heart sank. Emma's emotions were raw, and for the first time, he saw the deeper pain beneath her anger. This wasn't just a case of financial betrayal. Emma had spent years in the shadow of her mother's cold, controlling presence, seeking validation that had never come. Now, with the shock of her mother's death sinking in, she was unraveling before him. I confronted her about the policy, Emma continued, her voice shaking. I just wanted to know why. I thought if I understood, I could move on. But she was so dismissive. She said it didn't matter, that I'd never understand. I didn't know what to do. And when I saw her sitting there looking at me like I was nothing, I couldn't control it anymore. I picked up the vase and I didn't stop. Henderson felt a pang of sympathy for Emma. Her words were coming out now, raw and unfiltered, and it was clear that she was grappling with the depth of what she had done. She wasn't just confessing to a crime. She was confronting years of repressed hurt, years of being overlooked and misunderstood by the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally. But the question still lingered. Was this just a tragic act of passion, or was there more to the story? Emma's grief was real, but was it the kind of grief that could drive someone to murder? Emma, you need to understand, Henderson said, his tone steady. What happened that day wasn't just an outburst. It wasn't just anger over the insurance policy. There were signs of a struggle, and the physical evidence suggests you were far more involved in this confrontation than you've let on. Emma closed her eyes, tears brimming. I never wanted this to happen, Detective. I never thought it would go that far. I just wanted her to hear me. As Emma's confession came to a close, Henderson felt the weight of the investigation shift. The motive was clear. Now, years of emotional neglect, a shattered bond, and a final act of desperation. Emma's rage, while extreme, was born from years of pent-up frustration and a need for validation that had never been met. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What exactly had triggered Emma's final attack? And who else knew about the family's hidden secrets? The investigation was moving toward its climax, but it was far from over. Henderson had a hunch that this case had many more layers to reveal. There were more people to speak to, more truths to uncover. The investigation had just begun to scratch the surface. Detective Henderson couldn't shake the sense that Emma Davis's confession wasn't the end of the story. Yes, her emotions had been raw and her guilt undeniable, but there was still something about the case that felt incomplete. He couldn't ignore the nagging thought that someone, or something, had been pulling strings behind the scenes. Emma had confessed to the act itself, but Henderson suspected that there might be more to her motivation than just a chaotic explosion of grief and anger. Her mother's decision to alter her life insurance beneficiary was the catalyst for the murder. Yes, but why had Karen made that choice in the first place? And why had Emma only reacted so violently once she discovered it? Henderson knew he had to dig deeper. There was no way this was just about a mother and daughter, a policy, and a sudden outburst of rage. He needed to understand who else had been involved, or at least who might have benefited from Karen's death in a way that had remained hidden. The first step was to take a closer look at the people surrounding Karen Davis, particularly the ones closest to her in the months leading up to her death. Henderson revisited the statements of the people who had been around the Davis family. He had already spoken with Dr. Lucy Blackwell from the Cancer Research Foundation, but he now wanted to know more about Karen's social circle, those who had been with her in the last year of her life, before the diagnosis, after it, and in the final months. As he reviewed the records, a few names stood out: Karen's financial advisor, a man named Richard Langley, and her personal assistant, Anna Mitchell. Both of these individuals had significant access to Karen's estate and financial matters. Henderson decided to start with Langley. Richard Langley was a sharply dressed, well-groomed man in his late 50s, his gray hair neatly combed back, his posture rigid. He met Henderson at his office, a sleek, modern building that smelled of leather and polished wood. "Detective Henderson, I understand this is about Karen," Langley said as he gestured for Henderson to take a seat across from him. "I'm deeply sorry for her passing. She was an exceptional client, one of the best." Henderson studied Langley carefully, sensing a level of professionalism that seemed a little too practiced. Langley was doing everything right, the right words, the right tone, but something felt off. "I need to ask you a few questions about Karen's financial matters," Henderson said, leaning forward. "She made some significant changes to her life insurance policy recently, and I'm trying to understand what might have motivated that." Langley's eyebrows furrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Karen was a very private woman, Detective. She preferred to keep her finances to herself. But if you're asking about the insurance policy, I can tell you that it was all above board. Karen decided to change the beneficiary to the Cancer Research Foundation. She felt it was important to make sure her money went to something meaningful. It was part of her legacy." "Did she ever discuss with you why she chose the foundation?" Henderson asked, watching Langley's reaction closely. Langley hesitated for a moment, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he regained his composure. "Not directly, no, but Karen was a philanthropist at heart. She'd been working with the foundation for years, making large donations. It seemed like a natural progression for her to make that final decision. She told me she wanted to leave a lasting impact." Henderson took a mental note of Langley's words. He wasn't sure if the financial advisor was hiding something, but it was clear that Langley had been involved in the planning of Karen's finances. He wasn't just a bystander. Henderson pressed on, pushing deeper. "Was there anyone else involved in managing Karen's estate? Someone who had access to her personal matters? Someone who might have had a more intimate relationship with her?" Langley's eyes narrowed, but he didn't seem alarmed. "There's Anna Mitchell, her personal assistant. She was with Karen every day. If anyone knew about Karen's private matters, it was her." Henderson arranged to meet Anna Mitchell the next day. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with soft brown eyes that appeared kind but tired. Her appearance suggested someone who had been working too many hours, but her demeanor was calm as she welcomed Henderson into her office, a modest space tucked away in the corner of the building. "Detective Henderson, I'm sorry about Karen. She was like family to me," Anna said softly, sitting down across from him. "I know this must be difficult for you." Henderson replied, observing her carefully. But I need to ask you about Karen's last months, specifically about her decision to change the beneficiary on her life insurance policy. Anna's face faltered for a moment, and Henderson noticed a subtle shift in her posture. She was clearly uncomfortable with the question, but after a brief pause, she sighed and leaned forward. Karen was very secretive about her affairs. She didn't like anyone prying into her life. But I'll tell you this. She didn't make the change for any selfish reasons. She was passionate about the foundation, yes, but there was something else. Something she never told me directly, but I knew she was afraid of something. Henderson's interest piqued. Afraid of what? I'm not sure, Anna said, her voice trembling slightly. But I could tell something was off. Karen had been more distant in the months before her death. It was like she was preparing for something. I thought it was just the stress of her illness. But now I wonder if she was preparing herself for her own death. Henderson nodded slowly. This was something new. The idea that Karen had been preparing for death wasn't just about her illness. It suggested something deeper, a fear, perhaps, that had driven her to make decisions she hadn't shared with anyone. Did Karen ever speak about any threats, any outside pressure that might have influenced her decisions? Henderson asked. Anna paused for a moment, then shook her head. No, but she did have some issues with her daughter. Emma wasn't happy with Karen's decisions. They argued a lot, especially in the months leading up to her death. I could hear them sometimes through the walls. They didn't always get along, but I didn't think it was serious. I never thought Emma would. Anna's voice faltered. Henderson leaned forward, sensing the breakthrough. Would what, Anna? You can tell me. I never thought Emma would go that far. But Karen was worried. She was worried about what Emma might do if she found out about the change to the beneficiary, Anna admitted, her eyes welling with tears. Karen knew that Emma felt entitled to everything. She was angry all the time, and Karen didn't know how to deal with it anymore. As Anna's words hung in the air, Henderson's mind raced. Emma's relationship with her mother had been complicated, but now it seemed that there was more than just emotional hurt at play. Karen had been worried about something, perhaps the anger that had been building in Emma for years. It seemed that the daughter had more than just a financial stake in her mother's life. She had a personal vendetta that was simmering beneath the surface. But what did Karen fear? What had she known that made her so worried? Henderson felt closer than ever to unraveling the true reason behind Karen's decision to change the beneficiary. And more importantly, he was beginning to understand why Emma had acted so violently. But there was still one question that loomed large. Had someone been manipulating Emma all along? Was there someone else involved in this web of deceit and betrayal? Henderson couldn't stop now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the full picture was still far from clear. Detective Henderson's mind churned as he left Anna Mitchell's office. The personal assistant's admission about Karen's fear, combined with the tension in Emma's relationship with her mother, added an intriguing layer to the case. It was becoming increasingly clear that there was more than just a mother-daughter argument behind Karen's death. The question was no longer whether Emma was guilty, it was whether there were other forces at play. Forces that might have been pushing Emma to the brink. The next step was to dig deeper into Karen's past. If she was indeed worried about Emma's reaction to the beneficiary change, it suggested that Emma's behavior had become more unpredictable in recent months. Was Emma acting on her own, or was there someone else, someone more calculated, manipulating her? Henderson decided to start by re-examining Karen's records, not just her financial files, but any correspondence, letters, emails, or other forms of communication. He wanted to understand the relationships Karen had been forming or severing in the last months of her life. If Emma was under the influence of someone, it could very well be documented somewhere. Later that evening, Henderson sat at his desk, the flickering light of his desk lamp casting a soft glow over a pile of papers and files. He pulled up a series of emails between Karen and her foundation, but it wasn't until he reached a set of personal letters from her to an old friend that he found something of interest. One letter in particular stood out. It was dated just 3 weeks before Karen's death. Dear Elaine, I've been meaning to reach out to you for some time. I've been battling my own demons these past few months. feeling increasingly distant from my daughter. She's not the same girl I raised. I think she's becoming obsessed with money, with the idea of entitlement. I've always tried to give her everything, but I'm starting to realize that some things can't be bought. I feel like she's not seeing the real me, only what I can offer her. It breaks my heart to think I might lose her for good. I've made a decision regarding the beneficiary of my life insurance. I'm not sure how Emma will take it, but I feel it's the right thing to do. I've been funding the foundation for years, and I want my legacy to be something that helps others, not something that fuels greed. I just hope she doesn't resent me for it. Karen. Henderson felt a chill as he read through the letter. It confirmed much of what Anna Mitchell had said. Karen had been worried about Emma's reaction to the change in the beneficiary, but it also added something new, a growing concern that Emma was becoming consumed by entitlement. This wasn't just about the money, it was about something far deeper, a sense of betrayal, a loss of connection. The letter was signed off in a way that suggested Karen was preparing herself for something. She spoke of the beneficiary change as if it was the last straw, the final breaking point in a relationship that had been deteriorating for some time. But what did Karen know? What had she feared? Henderson took a deep breath. There was still one more lead to follow before he could draw conclusions. Richard Langley, the financial advisor. The man had been involved in arranging Karen's will and her life insurance policy. Henderson needed to know if Langley had been privy to Karen's concerns about Emma, or if he had been playing a part in some kind of manipulation. Langley was more than just an advisor. He was a gatekeeper to Karen's financial world. And if there was a hidden motive behind Karen's actions, Langley might be the one to reveal it. The next day, Henderson made his way to Langley's office. The financial advisor had been cooperative in the past, but now Henderson needed to ask more pointed questions. As Langley greeted him, Henderson could see that the man's calm exterior was starting to crack. The tension in the room was palpable, and Henderson wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. "Mr. Langley," Henderson began, his voice low and steady, "I've been looking into Karen's last few months. We've been discussing her decision to change the beneficiary on her life insurance policy, and I'm starting to think that there may be more at play here than just a simple decision about charity." Langley's jaw tightened, and he glanced away briefly before meeting Henderson's gaze. "Detective, I assure you that Karen's decision was entirely her own. She was very clear about her wishes regarding the beneficiary change. If you're implying anything else, I must insist that I had no part in it." Henderson wasn't convinced. "You were the one who helped her with the paperwork, correct? You had access to all her financial accounts, her wills, her life insurance. You were in a position to know about her concerns, about Emma's relationship with her." Langley's expression hardened. "I had no involvement in any personal matters between Karen and Emma. Karen's decisions regarding her estate were entirely her own. She was clear in her intentions." Henderson could sense the man was growing defensive, but there was something off about his reaction. He had no reason to be so adamant unless there was something more to the story. "Tell me, Mr. Langley," Henderson pressed, leaning in slightly. "What did Karen say about Emma's financial situation? Did she ever mention anything about concerns regarding Emma's behavior?" Langley's eyes flickered, and Henderson immediately recognized the sign of hesitation. "She mentioned that Emma had been struggling with her personal finances?" "Yes," Langley admitted, his voice tight. "But I wouldn't say it was anything out of the ordinary. Emma had been upset with her mother for some time. Karen was trying to manage the relationship, trying to make peace. But it wasn't easy. Emma had a lot of resentment toward her mother, and Karen was becoming increasingly frustrated with her behavior." Henderson sat back in his chair, the pieces clicking into place. It wasn't just the insurance policy that had driven Emma to act. It was a deeper sense of resentment, of feeling overlooked, of being forced into a role she didn't want to play. And Karen had known that. But was there more? Had Langley been merely an innocent party in this? Or was there more to his involvement? Henderson needed to know more about Langley's relationship with Karen. Had it been entirely professional, or was there something personal beneath the surface? As Henderson left Langley's office, he felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. He was no closer to understanding the full scope of the motive. Emma's anger had been clear, her confession raw. But was it just anger? Or had someone pushed her in that direction? Had Langley or someone else been subtly manipulating the situation? There were still too many unanswered questions. Henderson knew he had to go back to the Davis estate. There, he might uncover the final pieces, the ones that would explain why Emma had been driven to kill her mother and whether she had been truly alone in her actions. The investigation was far from over, but Henderson was determined. He would follow every lead, no matter how small, until he understood the truth. Only then could justice be served. Detective Henderson stood in front of the Davis estate, the large mansion that had once been filled with the warmth of family, but now stood as a cold reminder of a life cut short. He had pieced together much of the story in the past few days, but there was still one last crucial step: the final confrontation. If he was to make sense of the twisted motives behind Karen's death, he had to return to the scene and confront those who might still be hiding something. Henderson had spent hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following up on leads. Now he stood before the house, wondering if the final pieces of the puzzle were hidden within these walls. He had already spoken to Emma, and she had confessed to the murder, but he still didn't fully believe it was as simple as a daughter snapping under pressure. Something didn't add up. Karen's life insurance policy had been changed, yes, but Emma's emotional state seemed to suggest there was more at play. The way Anna Mitchell and Langley had both spoken about Karen's fears had shown there was more to this than just a family quarrel. Henderson's first stop was the room where Karen had been found. It was untouched, preserved as evidence, frozen in time. Karen's life had ended in this room, and Henderson hoped that retracing the steps would offer new insight into the events of that night. Inside the room, everything was still. The faint smell of jasmine lingered in the air, a remnant of the candles Karen had likely used to calm her nerves. The window was open slightly, letting in a cool breeze from the night. Henderson surveyed the room, his eyes landing on the desk where Karen had written her final letter to Elaine. That letter had struck him as a sign of Karen's growing fear, a hint that she had sensed something coming. But there was something else in the room that caught his eye: an envelope on the desk, tucked behind a stack of papers. It was a small detail that he'd missed during his initial visit. Henderson approached the desk and carefully picked up the envelope. The handwriting on it was unfamiliar, but it was addressed to Karen Davis. The name on the return address was one that stood out: Richard Langley. His heart skipped a beat. Why would Langley be sending Karen a letter? The man had insisted his involvement was purely professional, and yet here was a letter with his name on it, sent after the beneficiary change. Could this be the missing piece? Henderson felt a growing sense of urgency. He opened the letter slowly, trying not to disturb it too much. Dear Karen, I hope this letter finds you well. I understand the weight of the decisions you've made recently, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, should you need any support. I know it's been difficult for you to manage everything, and I've sensed your growing anxiety over Emma. She's been pushing harder for answers, and I fear that you might be underestimating how deeply this change has affected her. She's not someone who handles rejection well, and I've seen how that frustration has begun to turn inward. You may think Emma will understand your reasons for the change, but I fear you're mistaken. She has a way of seeing things that might not be in her best interest, and her feelings of abandonment could be too much for her to bear. If you ever need to discuss this further, or if you want someone to help mediate between you two, please reach out. I want to help make this transition as smooth as possible for all of us. Best regards, Richard Langley. Henderson read the letter twice, his mind racing. Langley's words were filled with a certain manipulation, an attempt to sow doubt in Karen's mind. It was clear that Langley had been aware of Emma's anger, but the tone of the letter made it seem like he was encouraging Karen to think about her daughter's feelings, to second-guess the change she'd made. But there was something even more troubling in Langley's words. The letter spoke not just of concern, but of an almost personal connection. He was warning Karen, almost as if he knew exactly how fragile the situation was. And the most damning line of all was when he mentioned that Emma might not handle rejection well. Had Langley anticipated the violence that might erupt? Was he manipulating the situation for his own benefit? Henderson's instincts screamed that Langley had played a larger role in this case than he had let on. It was time to confront him. Henderson drove to Langley's office, his thoughts swirling. As he entered the building, he could feel the tension in the air. Langley had been careful, but now Henderson had the evidence to take him down. He wouldn't walk away from this without an answer. When Henderson arrived, Langley was in his office, perched behind his desk. He looked calm, perhaps too calm. "Detective Henderson," Langley greeted, his tone neutral. "I wasn't expecting you today." Henderson didn't waste time. He placed the letter from Langley to Karen on the desk, watching the financial advisor's face closely. "I think we need to talk, Mr. Langley," Henderson said, his voice low. "This letter you sent to Karen, care to explain it?" Langley's eyes flickered, and he quickly reached for the letter, but Henderson stopped him. "Don't bother, I've already read it." Langley took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know what you think you found, Detective. That letter was just a professional gesture. I was trying to ease Karen's mind about the situation with her daughter." Henderson shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You were manipulating her. You were the one who knew exactly what was going on in Karen's life, and you knew how Emma would react to being cut out. You planted that seed of doubt in Karen's mind. You made her second-guess her decision, even though she was doing the right thing. And then you watched as the situation escalated." Langley's calm demeanor cracked for a split second, and Henderson caught the flicker of guilt. Langley's facade was slipping. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt," Langley said, his voice almost pleading. "I was just trying to protect Karen, to make sure everything went smoothly. But I had no idea Emma would do that." Henderson leaned in. "You knew Emma's emotional state. You knew she was angry. You knew Karen's decision was a breaking point. And yet you encouraged her to hesitate, to question the change, because you knew it could have serious consequences. You weren't just Karen's advisor. You were playing a dangerous game." Langley's eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, Henderson saw a man unraveling, the guilt and fear settling in. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never thought Emma would go that far. Why didn't you step in? Why didn't you intervene before it was too late?" Henderson demanded. Langley's shoulders slumped as he sighed deeply. "I never thought Emma would cross that line. She was always so dependent on her mother, but I couldn't see what was really happening beneath the surface. I thought I could control the situation, but I was wrong." Henderson's expression hardened. "Langley, you didn't just miss the signs. You encouraged the storm. You pushed Karen into a corner where her daughter felt betrayed, and now someone is dead because of your manipulation." The arrest of Richard Langley was inevitable. The man had been a key player in Karen's life and had used his position to manipulate her, all while covering his own tracks. But the case wasn't as clear-cut as Henderson would have liked. He had discovered a new dimension to the crime, one of psychological manipulation that pushed Emma to commit murder. But it was only the tip of the iceberg. Langley's role in the tragedy couldn't be overstated, but Emma's own psychological state, her years of unresolved tension with her mother, and the immense pressure of being pushed to a breaking point all contributed to the violent act. As Henderson left Langley's office, he felt a heavy sense of closure settling in. The case was far from simple, but at least the truth had come to light. Emma had acted on her own emotions, but Langley had played a hand in stoking the fire. It was a tragic tale of manipulation, emotional fragility, and the dire consequences of pushing someone too far. Justice would come in time, but